If you're interested in learning about the roller coaster of Zora Neale Hurston's work being published and receiving awards while she experienced constant financial issues, then my Black History Short about Zora Neale Hurston's later life is for you. Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be sharing what I've learned about Zora Neale Hurston's later life. This episode covers the period of her life from 1927 to January 28, 1960. If you haven't already checked out the episode about her early life, I suggest you start with that first and then come back to this one as it offers some important background. The latter half of the 1920s would see the publication of several of Hurston's short stories and articles. She would also become Barnard's first Black graduate upon completion of her bachelor's degree in 1928. She enrolled in a PhD program in anthropology at Columbia University, and during those 2 years also continued her studies with Boas. Hurston would travel throughout the South and the Caribbean to gather information about language, culture, and hoodoo/voodoo across the Black diaspora. With increased financial pressure due to the Great Depression, Hurston settled on the idea of adapting her work for the stage. One of her plays, The Great Day, was staged in New York City, but closed after one performance due to the lack of a producer and financing. Undefeated, she staged 2 plays at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, which featured locals from her hometown. While none of the plays were major successes, they fulfilled her dream of operating a Black theater company. The plays also indirectly brought attention from publishers as a result of the theater director submitting one of her short stories to a magazine. Hurston moved once again to nearby Sanford to begin working on a novel in reply to publisher Bertram Lippincott's request for submission. Hurston's novel was accepted, and her first 2 books, Jonah's Gourd and Mules and Men, were published. But it was her 1936 win of the Guggenheim Fellowship that would prove to be a game changer as it financed her visits to Jamaica and Haiti. She began writing a story about her passionate relationship with her lover, who inspired the development of the character Tea Cake. Written in 7 weeks, Their Eyes Were Watching God was published a year later and became one of Hurston's most popular novels. The book would become popular in time, but did not provide a financial windfall at the time of its release or within Hurston's lifetime. It continued a trend that had begun when Hurston was still back in Harlem. Their Eyes Were Watching God and some of her other creations told the story of Black women and rural Black people who were largely ignored within literature at the time. Women, and Black women in particular, were expected to be meek and mild, primarily in the background, if not completely out of sight. Hurston's work was criticized by other writers such as Richard Wright and her former friend Langston Hughes for allegedly pandering to white readers. Some of her characters were Black people from rural areas, and she wrote their dialogue based on her personal experience and what she'd observed during her research. Some white critics regarded the characters and language as being stereotypical. Yet Hurston saw her characters as being unapologetically Black. While she collaborated with white people, Hurston opposed desegregation as she felt it would require Black people to assimilate into mainstream American culture, losing their own culture in the process. She believed it was more empowering to write Black characters who were immersed in their own lives and communities, rather than the discrimination they faced from general society. In 1938, Hurston published another book, but her career fizzled out. She found employment with the Works Progress Administration for a year, and also interviewed former slaves for the Florida Negro. The 1942 release of her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, brought some renewed attention, but nothing that sustained long term. Adding to Hurston's problems was her being falsely accused of molesting a 10-year-old boy. The accusation would prove baseless due to Hurston's passport confirming that she was in Honduras during the alleged time of the assault, and the boy admitting that he'd lied. But the experience of the story being publicized was embarrassing and emotionally devastating for Hurston. The last decade of Hurston's life saw her living quietly with continued financial problems. She continued to write for magazines and newspapers and worked at times as a librarian, substitute teacher, and maid. Poor health resulted in multiple strokes in 1958, and she became a resident at a nursing home where she died on January 28, 1960. After her death, funds had to be raised for Hurston's funeral, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. Her most recent creations had been rejected by publishers, and most of her books that had been published were now out of print. Fortunately, some of her manuscripts were saved from being burned along with her other possessions. As had been the case during the last decade of her life, Zora Neale Hurston was largely forgotten. But inspired by her work, 13 years later, Alice Walker visited Hurston's grave, on which she placed a headstone. 2 years later, Walker published In Search of Zora Neale Hurston in Miss Magazine, which reawakened interest in Hurston. Since then, Hurston's work, Their Eyes Were Watching God in particular, has enjoyed a place of honor in literature. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes and sources are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. I'm working on creating downloadables and infographics, so keep an eye on the website. These Black History Shorts are released every Tuesday, so if you enjoy this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my Black History Shorts playlist.